Gumbadaru, Gumbananigianidu, Yurigari Alia Information Online 2021 GU. Good morning, it's good to see you and welcome to our friends to Alia Information Online 2021 in Barragum, which is the language of the community that I grew up on the Darling Downs. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands we are meeting on today and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. This morning, I'm at Kirilpa Point, which is historically a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we proudly continue that tradition today. My name's Vicky Mcdonald, and I'm the State Librarian and CEO at State Library of Queensland, but I also have the privilege to be the Program Chair. And on behalf of the committee, I welcome you to Alia Information Online. Our theme for today is access or control, and the theme intends to challenge us to look at technology and information in new ways. Our conceptions of ownership, access and control are shifting, and these themes will be explored today. I'm absolutely thrilled to share with you that today we have over 2,705 delegates joining us, which is an absolute record for an ALIA conference, and fantastic that so many colleagues have access to today's program. All today's sessions will be live streamed and they'll be shown through the sessions, but will also be available following the conference. The Twitter hashtag is InfoOnline21, and I encourage you to join the Twitter stream. Now, to get started, I'd like to introduce our first keynote. Eric Kleinenberg is the Helen Gould Shepherd Professor of Social Science and Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. And of course, he is the author of Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. And you can read Eric's full bio on the conference pages. Eric will be presented via pre-recorded video, but he is also attending this morning's session, and he'll be joining for live Q&A following his session. So questions for Eric can be submitted during the session using the Ask a button at the bottom of the page. I'd like to thank Biblioteca for making Eric's participation possible today, and I encourage you to visit Biblioteca's virtual booth during the breaks. So please welcome Eric to Alia Information Online 2021.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Kleinenberg. I'm speaking to you from Manhattan, from New York City, near New York University. And I want to tell you before we get into this, just how disappointed I am that I can't be there with you today in person. This was really one of the speeches and trips I was most looking forward to. I really wanted to be able to come to Australia, and I so hope that before too long, I can make the trip and meet you face to face, because as lucky as we are to live our lives on Zoom, it's just not as good as actually being in a room with each other. And that's one of the big themes I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about libraries, about social infrastructure, about how we connect and how we rebuild as we start to put things back in place when we reach this post-pandemic situation. And I know you're a lot closer to that in Australia than we are here in the United States. It has not been a glorious time for us here, and we are still stuck in the middle of things. But I'm going to speak today in hope that we won't be here forever. So let me just begin by bringing up a slide, and I hope that will work for you. This is a quick image of the book I wrote about libraries and social infrastructure called Palaces for the People, and my Twitter handle in case you're interested in hearing more from me after this. But I want to begin by taking you back about a year now, a little less than a year, when the COVID pandemic first started to show its face, and no one really knew what to do to prevent major catastrophe and prevent this disease from spreading. And the World Health Organization issued a call for all of us to do what they called social distancing. They said, look, when we don't really understand how this virus works, we don't know how to treat it, we don't know exactly how it spreads. This is, February, March 2020. So we recommend for the moment that people do social distancing. And I heard that idea from the World Health Organization, and I understood what they were trying to get at. The concept, the goal of the idea made sense to me, but I realized right away that this was a potential catastrophe, social distancing. In some ways, I grew fearful that this was the worst possible message, right? Because what you need in a pandemic is not social distancing if you want to survive. What you need is physical distancing, right? It's our physical proximity to each other that determines whether we spread the disease. It's not our social closeness, right? In fact, what I realized when I saw the World Health Organization's message is that in a way, the pandemic calls for a kind of social solidarity that we have been needing for some time, but requires it with even more urgency. I mean, after all, solidarity, social closeness, our capacity to look after each other, that's what can really make the difference between life and death when we're in a dire situation. If you think about social closeness and solidarity in the context of employment, if you live in a society, as I do in the United States, where there's so little solidarity that workers don't have basic protections. And if you have a low-wage job, say serving food in a restaurant, you worry that if you don't show up for work, even when you're feeling sick, you might not just lose pay, but potentially lose your job. Well, what's going to happen is you're much more likely to show up at work, even when you're sick. And it turns out that's what people in the United States do. And if you're sick with something like COVID-19, you're infinitely more likely to spread it to other people. The disease takes off, right? Or if you live in a society, as I do, where we don't invest enough in public education, and so many people don't know enough to distinguish between the ordinary flu and a novel and potentially lethal coronavirus, then when the latter comes around, if you have a leader who says, yeah, it's no big deal, people will take it as no big deal. And again, that's exactly what happened here. It was in fact our social distance from each other that made us vulnerable, right? And what we really needed above all was social proximity, social solidarity. And so I wrote an article in the New York Times saying the formula for getting through this is physical distance, social solidarity, physical distance, social solidarity. And I still believe that today. I have to tell you, I learned this lesson the hard way. The first book I wrote was a book about a heat wave in Chicago in 1995. And I know I'm speaking to you in the summer of 2021 in Australia, and I know what brutal summers you've been having recently. You know about the dangers of heat waves. In Chicago in 1995, there was a heat wave that killed hundreds of people in just a few days. Now, this was at a time when the deaths of hundreds of people in excess of the norm was a big deal. Unfortunately, this past year in the United States, we have thousands of people dying every day. So when I talk to younger people here, it's hard for them to fathom what a big deal this was, but more than 700 people died in Chicago from a heat wave that lasted just a couple of days. And what was so dangerous in Chicago is that thousands of people were living alone and aging alone. And they were discovered precisely because they were so socially distant from people around them. And it turns out that their isolation made the difference between life and death. I was just starting graduate school in sociology when this heat wave happened, and I wanted to understand, why so many people died alone in the city. And I looked first at the big infrastructure systems in Chicago, and sure enough, the power had gone out and the transit systems had gone out. Even water systems had gone down because so many Americans and people in Chicago were opening up their fire hydrants to try to keep cool. They didn't have air conditioning. But I learned that it wasn't actually the hard infrastructure, the kind of traditional physical infrastructure. What really determined who lived and who died was the quality of the social infrastructure. So I looked, for instance, at neighborhoods in Chicago to see, which places did well and which did poorly. And when I looked at the map of mortality in Chicago, I saw first, something I expected, which is that the very poor neighborhoods, the very segregated neighborhoods did very poorly. They were the most vulnerable. Now, that was politically important to discover that, but it wasn't sociologically surprising. It's actually exactly what you would expect. So I had to look more closely. And when I walked around, I found these neighborhoods that were fascinating. They were neighborhoods that were identical demographically, high levels of poverty, segregated, all African American or Black, lots of vulnerability on a daily basis. Some of them look like this. This is a neighborhood called Auburn Gresham on the south side of Chicago. And then right across the street, there's a neighborhood called Englewood that looks like this. And it turns out that, if you look at this for a second, you might think, oh, that's a nice green landscape. That's a beautiful park. But the truth is it's not. It's a place that used to have a home and used to have a garden and now has an empty lot and has abandoned houses. And this is a place where the factories closed down and the businesses left and people left. And what was left behind is this kind of depleted landscape, empty lots, broken sidewalks, very little commercial activity, no real attractive public spaces. And people who live in neighborhoods like this, places that have a kind of depleted social infrastructure, tend to hunker down and stay home as a survival strategy. And that might keep them alive most of the time, but when there's a horrible heat wave, being isolated in your home, socially distant, can kill you. And these were the most neighborhoods that look like this were the most dangerous places you could be in Chicago. On the contrary, I found literally across the street from this neighborhood is this place, Auburn Gresham, also poor, also Black, also segregated. But here, look at the condition of the sidewalks. Look at the stairs or the stoops where people come and sit down. There's not a lot of abandonment here. In fact, on the contrary, people come to this neighborhood for the street life. And neighbors get to know each other. People go out to the public spaces, the sidewalks, the little pocket parks, the community organizations, the shops, and they see each other on a daily basis. And what that means is, if I live here and I'm an old man and I'm used to being outside every day, people know that I'm there. And if it's very, very hot, if there's a dangerous situation and I don't go out and people don't see me where they're used to seeing me, they come and knock on my door. And there's a support network that emerges, not just because people care about each other, they do, but the truth is they care about each other in this neighborhood also. People can take care of each other here because the social infrastructure allows them to do it. It encourages them to do it. And so sure enough, the death rate during the heat wave in this neighborhood was 10 times lower than it was in the other neighborhood. But more importantly, the life expectancy in this neighborhood is 5 times higher. Sorry, not 5 times, 5 years longer. 5 times higher would be crazy. 5 years longer than it is here. And I attribute that to social infrastructure. Now that's a funny concept, I know. What do I mean when I say social infrastructure? I mean that there is a social infrastructure that's just as real as the infrastructure we have for power or for water or for communications or for transit. And when I say social infrastructure, what I'm referring to is the set of physical places and the organizations that shape our interactions, right? When we invest in them, and when we build them well, when we design them well, when we maintain them, when we program them, when we invest in social infrastructure, we get all kinds of returns. It's much more likely we're going to engage each other. We're going to build something, friendships, community, some sense of understanding that stems from a face-to-face interaction with each other. But when we neglect social infrastructure, if we don't think about it when we do infrastructure planning or when we do urban planning or town planning, if we let the places we build fall apart. I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s and 80s, and generations before me had built amazing social infrastructure, but then let it kind of decay. There was austerity in the government, and we stopped maintaining things, stopped making them beautiful, stopped programming them. When you do that, you neglect it, people tend to hunker down, right? People get isolated, things fall apart. And I argue in my work that social infrastructure is totally essential for social life all the time. But as I've lived through the last year, watching how societies around the world have responded to the pandemic, I realize just how much we're going to need to rebuild social infrastructure if we're going to revitalize in the post-pandemic period. Now, my work on social infrastructure really got transformed by a different natural disaster. I was living in New York in 2012 when a hurricane called Sandy came through the region, and it was a devastating hurricane that took out the power from millions of people around the United States, and also took out the power in Manhattan, in the center of capitalism, the capital of capitalism. Here we were in a place that we thought would be invulnerable to something like a natural hazard. The power lines in Manhattan were underground, after all, but the storm swept through and flooded out the substations, and soon enough, New York was underwater. The damage was overwhelming, tens of billions of dollars in the region. And right after this happened, I organized a team of researchers at New York University, and we went around and we tried to understand, why some places did as badly as they did and why other places did better. We used the same technique as I did in Chicago. We looked at hard infrastructure systems, but we looked at social infrastructure systems too. And I started doing a lot of writing about it. I wrote an article for the New Yorker magazine about why New York had broken down the way that it did. And then one day out of the blue, I got this phone call from the Obama administration. And I don't know if anybody here on the call on our Zoom remembers Barack Obama, but Barack Obama, once upon a time, President of the United States. I'd like to think back on that as the age of reason in our country. It's been a long time since we were there. Maybe we're heading back to something like that now. But they called and they asked me if I would serve as research director for this thing that they were calling the Rebuild by Design competition. And the notion is that the federal government was going to invest a couple $2 billion in a project that invited innovative design teams of engineers and architects, landscape architects, city planners from around the world to come in and pitch ideas for how we could build the region back smarter in anticipation of 21st century threats. And I was asked to be the research director. It was an amazing opportunity. I got to take these teams from all over the world, all around our region, to show them how different places worked. And we could think together about the different needs and vulnerabilities and also possibilities in these places. This was an amazing opportunity. It was a very high pressure situation though, because there were a lot of dollars on the line, a couple $2 billion, and there were 150 teams from around the world made proposals to get into the competition. 10 were chosen. They had 9 months to come up with an idea through our process, and it was a very high profile competition. The people who won were going to get a chance to literally build and rebuild big important parts of Manhattan, of New York City, this place that so many people in the world are looking at. And so people felt a lot of pressure to do something amazing. And what happened is some of the teams got really nervous. And there was one team that had done extraordinary work around New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina years before. And this is going to take us to a topic I think you'll understand well. And they were really struggling to figure out what they wanted to do in this competition. They wanted to have an idea that was big and grand and inspiring enough to potentially win. And they reached out to me and they said, Eric, we've had a hard time, but finally we've come up with an idea for what we'd like to do. Can we pitch it to you? And I said, absolutely. And they said, well, we're thinking about creating a new prototype for a building that we're calling a resilience center. And they said, can we tell you about what a resilience center is? And I said, absolutely, I can, that you can. And they said, imagine if you can, a building that is a public building run by the government. It's a resilience center, and its goal is to be a kind of home away from home, where people can go all the time. People feel comfortable, and that way if there's ever a crisis, like a terrible heat wave, a drought, or a hurricane, whatever the crisis is, that if they can be together, they know to come to the Resilience Center. And they said, now imagine that the Resilience Center is staffed by these resilience professionals whose job is to be like aggressively welcoming, to keep the doors open and make sure everyone knows that they are welcome there. They said everyone should come, but we know that the people who are going to use the Resilience Center most are older people and younger people, because they're the most rooted in the neighborhood. Their routines are there. And we know younger people aren't just gonna come by themselves. So they're gonna come with caretakers, parents or grandparents or sitters. And so we're gonna need to have a bunch of programs for young people, like sing-alongs and reading hour, story time, crafts and things like that. And so we'll have a bunch of classes like that for young people in the morning. And then they said, for their caretakers, maybe we'll have a lot of comfortable furniture. We'll have Wi-Fi access. We could have computers and other technology around that they can use. And they said for older people, we could do things like book clubs and current events conversations, and also maybe like film nights and crafts classes, all those kinds of things, and that way people will always feel comfortable there. We'll draw the right people and they'll know that they can trust us. And they were so excited about this idea. They wanted to know what I thought. And I said to them, wow, that's a really exciting idea, a resilience center. It sounds really appealing to me. And I also said to them, have you ever heard of a library? And I didn't want to be rude about it. I mean, I was trying to be funny, I think, at the time. Maybe it came across as a little bit cheeky. But I got concerned when I heard their proposal that basically when they talked about building a resilience center, what they were really describing is something we already have but tend to neglect, called a library. The image you're looking at here is a photograph of one of my favorite branch libraries in New York City. It's called the Seward Park Library on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It's a Carnegie library. And as I'm sure you know, Andrew Carnegie, who is a, kind of a mixed person when it comes to human decency, a robber baron, paid for Pinkerton security, private security to beat up striking laborers, not admirable in all dimensions, but he was a great philanthropist, and he was the great philanthropist of the library. He contributed funds to build more than 2,500 libraries around the world, and some of them are kind of extraordinary places. This is an especially nice one. In fact, the title for my book, Palaces for the People, comes from Carnegie. It was his word to talk about what he wanted to build. His notion was that he was an immigrant himself to the United States, and he knew that a lot of people were living in small tenement apartments. They were very crowded, that they worked in factories that were dark and dirty, that they didn't have a lot of places that were dedicated to their education and their betterment. And the library, he said, would be like a palace for the people. It would have these high ceilings and big windows. You can see them in this building here. A lot of Carnegie libraries have steps that you go up as you walk in, just a few steps, and they take you from the mundane world of daily life into this kind of sacred space of the palace where you can improve yourself and read and learn and build bonds to the people around you. It was really a lovely, beautiful idea. And I reminded the team that was interested in a resilience center that we have something like this, but we tend to neglect it. And this place in particular on the Lower East Side of Manhattan is very interesting. It's a gentrifying neighborhood. And I know that in Australia, gentrification is an issue that you deal with in cities as well. That means, right around the corner from the library, there are parks that look like this. Now, this is a neighborhood that traditionally has been full of immigrants and low-income people who come to New York and try to build their lives. And increasingly, it has people who look more like this. People who wake up in the morning and say to themselves, where could I find a $12 scoop of ice cream from a place that only serves the flavor salt? And the people who wake up in the morning and are looking for that tend to go down to Seward Park because it's a neighborhood that's great if you're a young, wealthy person who's got a lot of money to spend on fancy boutique crafted things. But the downside of that is there are a lot of people who've lived there for a long time who feel, very much not welcome in the new spaces that are emerging. And I'm going to move my camera a little bit because there's a sign on this image, which is taken from a McDonald's not far away, that says, "No loitering." No loitering. You can't stick around. You can't stay here. Now, we know that if I went to this McDonald's just a block from that last photograph, I could sit there all day with my laptop and probably no one would say anything to me because I'm a white guy, I'm middle-aged, I'm a professor, I'm professional. But a lot of people who go there, especially people of color and poor people, find that in fact, they don't really have a place where they can stay and feel welcome, like they belong. They're kicked out. Now, get back to my screen. Here is the library, and you can see these steps that I just described, bringing you up out of the daily life, your daily life, and into this special space. Here's a place where every morning at opening hour, a librarian comes out, opens the door, and welcomes people in, and everyone is welcome into the public library in the United States. You don't need to be a citizen. You don't need to be a resident. You can be anyone. It doesn't matter what your social class is, what your race is, what your ethnicity is, whether you speak English, whether you have a job, you are welcome in the library. And that is an amazing thing. There's a scene that unfolds every morning in libraries across the United States and around the world where young people come eager to be in a place that offers them so much. And one of my favorite things about writing my book was getting to partake in this morning ritual of watching the library doors open. I love this image. And again, I'm going to move this image of me. This is a great shot, and I don't know how many of you can relate to it. This is, we happened to be there with a photographer on a day when this young girl was getting her first library card. You can see that red card in her hand, and that's her mother looking on and looking proud. And I love this moment because it reminds me that going to the library, becoming a user of the library isn't just about learning that there's a public sector, a government that's interested in helping you. It's also that you get acknowledged with something like a library card as an independent individual who's also part of a community. And you start to learn about your responsibilities as a community member. So for instance, this girl is learning today that she will be acknowledged and recognized by New York City with this card. It's her card. She can use it as she pleases with her mom's permission, of course. She can take out books, and she'll quickly learn that if she takes out this Curious George book, she has to take care of it. She can't draw on it. She can't put her gum in the pages. She has to return it, because if she takes care of it and does all those things, then other kids like her will be able to read that book as well. And she'll also figure out that she's got a vested interest in modeling that kind of behavior, because if other kids treat their books the way that she wants to treat hers, if they look out for other people also, then when she finishes this Curious George book, which I think is called Windy Delivery, the next one will be available to her because someone else will have returned it. And so that's an education in civic life. It's an education of what it is to share space, to share resources, to be connected to other people, right? Solidarity begins in places like this. And there are not a lot of places in our lives that do that. So another amazing thing about libraries in so many parts of the world is that because they're open to everyone, it means people who might not otherwise spend time together, encounter each other, deal with each other's differences, wind up face to face. And sometimes in very packed rooms, and I'm sure that will happen again soon as we get out of this pandemic situation. The United States is a very segregated society. I know Australia has its own ethnic divisions as well. I can tell you that in the years I've spent studying the United States, I have not seen places like the library, not many places that bring kids together from across those divisions. Playgrounds can do that, athletic fields can do that. They're all examples of social infrastructure. Places that give us the chance to engage one another in real time. And, the relationships here that build are amazing. I would ask you to think about how many relationships you think there are in Australia that begin with, two families that take their kids to the library at the same time. The kids are part of the same reading group or sing along, and you see that other family often enough that at some point you lift your face out of the phone and you talk to the other caregiver, or maybe you take a picture and you share it, and then you sit down and you have lunch together, and the next thing there's a play date, and then you meet their friends. That's the kind of thing that builds a community, right? That's something that transforms a neighborhood, a place, into something like a community. And I'd ask yourself to consider this morning, how many relationships do you think have started in Australia because two families meet each other in a library or a playground, some social infrastructure like that. What's the number, in the last decade in Australia? How many friendships, communities have come together that way? Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 100,000, a million, millions? It's a very big number, I bet. And it's the kind of thing we take for granted. Libraries are also places in many societies where people come to learn what it is to be a citizen there. They come to learn the basic set of civic skills, the history of the place, in this case, in the United States, the formal requirements for becoming a citizen. In the US, public libraries do more English as a second language instruction than any other institution. They do more training for people who are looking for work. They do all kinds of things. They lend clothes to people who are doing job interviews. They lend seeds to people who want to build gardens. They do computer education for older people who want to become computer literate. They provide Wi-Fi access for people who can't otherwise afford it. The set of things they do is truly extraordinary. This is one of my favorite images. Of course, libraries do more than just the serious things of book lending and providing information these days. They are increasingly civic hubs and community centers. This is a scene from a library in Brooklyn where the library system started something called the Library Lanes Bowling League. And once a week, older people from the library community sign up, and if they join the team, they get a bowling jersey. You can see their blue bowling jerseys. And a librarian hooks up an Xbox or PlayStation to a TV set, and they call another library team, and the different branch libraries compete against each other in this amazing bowling league. And it's an amazing thing because, these are people who have every reason to be home and alone and isolated and disengaged. They're the people who, tended to die in the heat wave in Chicago that I studied. In fact, there's a lot of concern in the US over the last few decades about this phenomenon that the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam calls bowling alone. A lot of concern that people like this would be the most disengaged, the most alienated, and I look at these smiles on the faces of people in the basement of the library, who are using the library as social infrastructure, as a civic space, as a community hub, as a place to rebuild and reconnect. And I think, how unlikely are these smiles in the world we live in today? How unlikely is the scene of what sociologists have always called collective effervescence, this scene of people just enjoying each other's companionship at a time when so many people are home and alone, and so many of us are concerned about the state of society. It's impossible to get this kind of thing outside of the library today. For that reason, you might understand why I was so frustrated years ago when there was an article that came out in Forbes magazine, a business magazine in the United States, where the author, who's an economist, argued that he said, until I see the cash benefits of investing in libraries, until I see the cost benefit analysis that shows me that cash is out, like why it's important for the public sector to support libraries, I propose that we knock down libraries or sell them and replace them with Amazon stores. He said, we'd be much better off as a society if we didn't use public resources for libraries, instead let the market do its magic, and we have Amazon instead. And he wrote this article, and I was shocked when I read it. It seemed like a cruel hoax, but it was real. And I got really angry. But then this amazing thing happened, which is that the librarians of the world united, and they got on Twitter, and they started writing these incredible testimonies about all the things that libraries do, all the ways in which contemporary libraries are amazingly relevant. It's not just as information hubs, but as places where people gather. As places that provide so many of the services that I told you about before, as places that allow us to come together, to connect to the world. People who use libraries as Wi-Fi access points, but people who use libraries as places to get books, as places to get videos, as places to go online with the computers that are there, as places to bowl, as places to learn a language, as places to educate children, to come together. as you need to come together if you're going to have a viable democratic culture and civic life. And this amazing thing happened, I have to tell you, which is that after about 24 hours, Forbes actually took this article down. They literally took it. It was so embarrassing to have it up online that they took it off the internet. And I often think of this as like the only good thing that's ever happened on Twitter. It was a pretty amazing moment. Meanwhile, that's not what you want to see. That isn't either. Let's see if I can get my screen back. This is what you want to see. Meanwhile, throughout the world, libraries are closing. Libraries are being closed by governments that are imposing a regime of austerity, that are trying to save money. I'm especially worried about what's going to happen in the United States and the United Kingdom and perhaps in Australia as our governments try to recover from this horrible pandemic and all the expenses that they've incurred, and potentially go back and make the same mistakes governments have made in the last 15 years of imposing austerity, cutting the budget for public spaces and for public goods in general, right? So many libraries are having their hours reduced, are seeing them close altogether. In England, you probably know in the last couple of years, many libraries have had to work on volunteer labor. When I grew up in Chicago in the 70s and 80s, libraries were open just a couple of days a week. They weren't maintained. They were deprogrammed. Librarians lost their jobs. I am so concerned that we've hit a moment where we need libraries more than ever. And we haven't done enough to show their value to policymakers who will determine their fate. In the pandemic, I thought so many times about all the things that libraries did to remain vital and necessary and useful to American communities, curbside holds and pickups, blasting out Wi-Fi from the street so people who had to do remote work or remote education and couldn't afford to have Wi-Fi at home could come to the library and get it, canceling all late fees, putting food outside, doing classes on Zoom, for basic literacy, for dancing, for conversation, for stories, songs for children. The libraries did tremendous amounts of programming, and as always, they were free or paid for with our taxes. They expanded their digital holdings, again, offering people the chance to get the things they needed without a cost. And it made me wonder, imagine what the experience would have been like had we knocked down the libraries and replaced them with Amazon. I mean, Amazon saw the pandemic as an opportunity to grow bigger and make more money than ever before. And they did. And Jeff Bezos is 1,000,000 times wealthier today than he was a year ago. And the libraries have less money than they did, but they've done far more. They've been totally essential. And I can't imagine getting by without them. So now I want to close by urging you, as you come out of the pandemic, and you're far, far ahead of us in the United States, because you have a notion of solidarity there, that you've shown some ability to come together, even with the polarization that you have in Australia, even with the kind of ethos of austerity that Australia has had in so many areas. You have come together and shown that you're willing to do extraordinary things to take care of each other. And in this next moment, I think the question of how we're going to take care of each other is more burning, more essential than it has been in generations. And as we think about how to rebuild, how to revitalize, how to come out of this, no doubt it will be a raging debate about where we invest our resources, where we come together, and how we do it. And I just want to say that as you start to think about the kind of infrastructure, the kind of vital infrastructure, the kinds of places that you need in Australia to come through this moment, I say look no further than the places where you work. The library is the most extraordinary social infrastructure we have. And I hope you can honor it and support it. And I know that in your work, that's what you do every day. And I hope you have a chance to do that in the years to come. So thank you very much. And I look forward to our conversation together.
Well, good morning, Eric, and welcome to Australia and to Information Online 21.
Thank you. This is the worst way to be in Australia. I would much rather be there in person. And I hope next year we can do it.
We'd love to have you come and visit us, Eric, anytime. I'm sure our libraries will open their doors to you. And I understand it's actually snowing in New York this evening for you.
It's a bad deal here in New York City.
Okay.
I'm ready. Just name the library that's open and I'll be there as soon as you send a ticket.
You can come to my library, definitely. Now, I better ask you some questions. I don't know whether you've been tracking, but our Twitter feeds is going gangbusters. There's lots of comments and things like that. But I think your comments around libraries as resilient centres has received a lot of endorsement from delegates today. And one of the questions that particularly we're getting a lot of comments around is demonstrating impact and how we actually convince policymakers of the importance of libraries. So the first question I have for you comes from Jane Cowell, who is from Victoria. And her question is, social connection impacts are long-term for health, community, environment, mental health, etc. How do we in libraries best build impact measures that can just demonstrate this over time? So the old chestnut of impact measures.
Yeah, well, it's like that economist who wanted the cost benefit analysis so they didn't have to knock them down and put up the Amazon shops, right? You have to get the metrics right. So, you know, when I did research on libraries in the US, I was amazed at how few library systems did a really good job of showing just how many programs they offered, how many people came through the door. They didn't do surveys showing what kinds of activities people really value in the library, what support networks they built in the library. So when policymakers look at libraries, they think, how many people took out books? And I love books. I hope you read my book, but that's not the measure we want. So I would address those kinds of social things and be creative. Partner with the local social scientists in your cities or towns and find ways to really capture all the activity that happens in libraries. And we're talking about data and numbers. I'll say one other thing. You need to tell your story. And one of the things I really found when I wrote this book and it came out in the US is there were librarians all over the country who felt we haven't been telling our story well enough. And they liked the book because it was a way to reframe the conversation. And I hope you'll do that too, because I don't know how it works in Australia, but in the US, as you've probably seen, a very powerful story is fortunately or unfortunately, often more powerful than numbers.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's those compelling stories of impact that we certainly need to be focused on sharing. So I'll just go to another question, this time from Ellen Forsyth from New South Wales. Libraries are not neutral, and this comes through in your research. How can we do better to reach more people in our communities, rebuilding connections and building new connections?
Boy, that's a great question and a tough one. And a lot of cultural institutions have learned that you can't just open the doors and tell people they're welcome. If you live in a society where there's a history of discrimination or segregation, some people feel welcome and others don't. And that means you have to do real outreach to make sure people recognize that they're truly wanted. And you also have to do a gut check, because as hard as we try, we sometimes stigmatize people and they feel less welcome than they should when they come through the door. So I think every library needs to be honest with itself and understand what it's doing to signal to people in its community, who belongs and who doesn't. Just doing some programming can go a long way, and making sure your staff is diverse can go a long way. I bet everybody who's here right now could look at their own personnel and figure out, and their programs, and find some ways to do better.
Okay. I guess one of the things, and you talked a lot about COVID and the impact of COVID in your presentation, and a lot of libraries have had to pivot to digital. And I guess the question that I've got in front of me now is from Louise Danoon from Queensland. And her question is can digital be social infrastructure? And I guess how do we make it effective social infrastructure?
I mean, the way that I think about it is that digital is important. It's obviously a big part of my world. I'm on Twitter. I tried to give you a shout out before we started today, and I'm thrilled to be able to connect and have conversations with you there. The way I see it is the digital is communications infrastructure, and it can help us get together face to face, but there's always something unsatisfying about it if it doesn't get to something that's more physical, where we can be with each other. And so I don't want to give you the wrong impression. I'm not a Luddite. I think, one of the amazing things about libraries in the 21st century is that they have embraced technology. They have evolved much more than many other public institutions, and all to the credit and benefit of libraries. But I think, social infrastructure, that's the physical stuff. And what we can be doing post-pandemic is thinking about how to make libraries places where people feel safe and comfortable. I don't know what it feels like in Australia right now. In the United States, things have been very bad for a long time. We've not been able to kind of defend ourselves and protect ourselves. And we are so eager to be back in person with each other. There's so many people here who just can't wait to share a room, to have a place to gather, but we're going to need it to be safe, and libraries can lead the way in showing us how to do that.
Yeah, I think, Eric, we're very fortunate in Australia in comparison to the rest of the world and the United States, and many of our libraries are now open, and people are coming together for events and interacting with each other and being that important place in the community. But lots of examples of similar things that libraries did during lockdowns to what you talked about as well.
Are you sure you don't want to send me a ticket to come right now? Because I'm ready, my bags are packed.
You're going to bring your family too, or just alone?
We're all coming. We're ready to play tennis. We want to be there. So
at the Australian Open. So there's another question here from Michelle Feely, and she's referring to the bowling group, which featured in your presentation, and just talking about lockdowns and COVID. Just how are they going? And she's made a comment. They must really be struggling with no social interaction.
We really are. I'll say this, because of the technology, and in part because libraries in the US have done such an amazing job of moving their programming to the digital realm, there are a lot of people who would be cut off totally, who are still engaged with each other online. But the truth is that here in the United States, people who are living alone and older people are really hurting. It's a physical loneliness. One of the interesting things I've been doing, I'm writing a book about the pandemic. So maybe next time I come, I'll talk to you about my book on the pandemic. And one of the things I've noticed is that people are actually more connected socially than they've ever been. They're on their devices, they're doing FaceTime and Zoom. We're talking to people we love, but we miss each other. We miss touch and intimacy, and people who are living alone are really suffering. And I hope we can get people back together safely soon.
Okay. Yeah, I think some people are commenting that they've never been more connected with the people in their apartments and places like that from COVID. It's been one of the outcomes. Yeah.
Look, I think the silver lining, if there's any of this moment, is that during this past year, I think a lot of us have come to recognize just how much we need each other and how much we want each other's companionship, how unsatisfying it is to live a life where we're just on our screens and on our phones. And that's been an issue. I say that as a parent as well as a person. I like my kids off their screens sometime. And I think we have a chance to rebuild something better. So the challenge for us, and it's a challenge for you and for us in the US, all around the world, is to rebuild that physical realm, to rebuild actual physical social infrastructure for when we're ready to come back. And we will come back. And this could be the pivotal moment that we've been waiting for, where we change our relationship to the planet and we change our relationship to each other. And we recognize that some things that we've taken for granted for a long time are things that we need to treasure and invest in. And so I'm really hoping that we come back with social infrastructure. And I think libraries are going to have to lead the way.
Well, I think we're ready to lead the way, and as you say, we've been that's been one of our strengths over many decades in actually being a vital part of our communities, adapting to what is needed for our communities as well. Unfortunately, the time just flies, Eric.
Oh no, we're done already?
Yeah, we've come to
the end. What if I want to stay?
Well, we'll have you back next time. Are you able to stay on Twitter and perhaps respond to some of the tweets that have gone through?
Yeah, I'll go on Twitter. You might not know this, but today is the most important American national holiday. It's Super Bowl Sunday.
Oh.
And the Super Bowl started at the same time as my talk, but my values are right. So I've been here. So I'm going to go, but I'll get back on Twitter and I'm going to check in with you. But if you see me kind of tweet an occasional thing about how much I can't stand some team or another, just forgive me. I'm being American.
Okay. We note that then, Eric. And again, thank you very much for participating in ALIA's Information Online 2021. It's been fantastic to have you with us this morning, and I do hope that we get to see you live and in person in Australia in the future.
Thank you. I can't wait. It's been an honor to be here. Thank you. Good luck, everyone. Take care.
Okay. And also thank you to Biblioteca for sponsoring Eric's participation. We're going to take a short morning tea break, and we'll be back in about 14 minutes. But please stay online for some morning yoga and take the time to visit the virtual exhibition. And our exhibitors are really an essential part of delivering this conference, so please show them your support. You can also view the latest products and services, ask questions, and even book a time with the exhibitors and meet with them virtually. So thank you for joining the session. Thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you for actually putting your posts on Twitter. It's fantastic to see the comments, and I know that Eric will get a lot out of reading them as well. So thank you, and we'll be back online in 13 minutes. See you then.